Make sure you're taking pictures, enjoy the root beer and the meat, and go axe throwing and all that kind of stuff. Take pictures and all that. So, all right. So we're going to jump into our teaching for this morning. And to do that as a way of introduction, I want to actually go back to something we did just a couple of minutes ago. If you were in this room when we first started, by the way, some of you come in late to worship, and you should figure that out. All right, when we first started this morning, our very first song that we did this morning was a song called "Oh Come to the Altar" by a band called Elevation Worship. And if you were in here, you remember it was like, "Oh, come to the altar, the Father's arms are open wide." I was going to try to sing it for you, but nobody wants me to do that, all right? And so we sang this song. I'm so glad that the worship crew put this song in the mix for this morning, because today we are starting our summer message series. Seems appropriate on the day when it's going to be 96 degrees outside. But we're starting our summer message series entitled Altars, a Place of Sacred Encounters. And so there was this connection of come to the altar when we sang this morning to our series Altars. And what we're doing in this series, I'm really, really, really excited about this series. But in the Old Testament, we actually see, as we read the Old Testament, a lot of times where there were altars built to the Lord. We actually see the phrase like, "and he built an altar to the Lord," or "and there an altar to the Lord was built." And so there are verses like these. And so these altars, they became places of sacred encounters in the Old Testament. And so what I want to do is, first, before we get too deep into this morning, I want to kind of establish what's an altar. What is an altar? What is this whole altar thing? And so this is the biblical definition of an altar. It's a place where praises and prayers are rendered unto God. And so these altars, which, by the way, were often, these altars were a bunch of piles of stones, kind of like these representations that we have here in this for this series on this stage here. And they're actually called Karen piles. And so no, not like a Karen, like a middle-aged white woman who gets mad at you, right? Not that kind of Karen, all right? All right? Like these are Karens, a C-A-I-R-N, Karen pile. And these were these moments where this was an altar to the Lord. There was building these piles of rocks as an altar to the Lord. And what happened at these piles of rocks were that God was encountered. And people would, they met God, they talked to God. They got real with God. Whether it was for something good or it was for something not so good, they got real with God. And so the series is an attempt for us this summer to do that exact same thing, is to look at these altars and get real with God. Some of you know that our theme this year in 2024 is that it's going to be our year, O-U-R-H. It's a year for us to open up, reveal, and heal. It's a place for us to get vulnerable, a time for us to be vulnerable this year. And so what we're doing in the series is to get vulnerable. So we've been talking in some series about getting vulnerable with each other, and we've been talking in some series about getting vulnerable with ourselves. And this is a series that we're going to talk about getting vulnerable with God. Getting vulnerable with God and having these sacred encounters of our own, and looking at these altars to say, if they had this encounter with God and it was a sacred moment for them, and there was something that changed, what things that maybe we can change in our lives because we can look at these altars. And so the idea is that ultimately, how do we make our life an altar to the Lord? That's the idea. And so I think it's going to be a fun series. And it's kind of cool because I don't know what it's been. For some reason, we've been spending a lot of time in the Old Testament this year. And I think sometimes it's easier to be in the New Testament, post-Jesus and those kinds of things. But I think there's a lot of fruit in the Old Testament. And so I'm excited that we get to spend some more time in the Old Testament this summer. And so from now until the end of August, we're going to be each week looking at an altar of the Lord that was built and the encounter that ensued there, the sacred encounter, and what meaning that can have in our lives. And so it should be a good summer, should be a good series. Make sure you're here for as many of them as you can be. I know people are going to be traveling and going for vacations and all that kind of stuff, but even catch up online afterwards if you can, all right? And so today we're going to kick things off with likely a familiar story, a familiar altar if you've been in the Bible much. And I actually want to have you guess the altar we're going to look at this morning. And I want to do it what I'm calling Jimmy Fallon popular mathematics style. If that might not mean anything to you, but I'm a huge Jimmy Fallon fan. I like to watch his clips in the morning and laugh, to start my day with laughter. And so I do that. And so he has a skit and bit on his show that he calls Popular Mathematics. And so he'll do something like this. He'll say, like, if you take $1 minus 95 cents, you get the band Nickelback. You see how? So you guys are much more awake. The first service, it was like silent crickets, baby. I was like, man, we're going to go something different on that. So like, it's like that, okay? I think it's kind of funny. Like $1.95, you get nickel back. All right, so I want to have you try to guess this like popular mathematics style, okay? So if you take rope, okay, plus wood, plus my only son Elijah, take rope, wood, plus my only son Elijah, what altar do you think that we're going to look at in the story in the Bible? Oh, some of you got it, right? We're going to look at Abraham's altar this morning. And if you don't know that story, we'll give it to you in just a minute, all right? But this is where Abraham takes his only son Isaac and some rope and some wood, kind of goes with what I was just talking about, right? And he goes up on Mount Moriah where God tells him to do something with his son Isaac, kind of interesting, by the way. And we're going to look at it. It's kind of an impossible task in some senses. But the cool part about it and why we're looking at it is because it indeed became a sacred encounter, not only for Abraham, but also for Isaac. And there's some really good things that we can take from this story. So let's jump into this and read this story, and then I'll give you a couple ideas to think about in regards to this particular altar, what we can take from it. But I will tell you, this very first altar, kind of doozy, okay? Kind of doozy. So we're going to look at Genesis 22, if you want to turn there in a Bible, and read 1 through 13. We're going to skip just a few verses as well. All right, so let me read this, and then we'll jump in. So it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Skip to verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? He's kind of getting suspicious, like what's happening here? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place where God had told him about, Abraham, and here's our phrase that we're looking at in this series, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went out and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. So that's our text today. Again, kind of a doozy of an altar that we're going to look at this morning, but I think some really good stuff in there for us. Especially even, I think this is a good conversation to have, story to read on Father's Day as a story between a father and son. And so before I jump in, I want to pray, and then I'll give you a couple things to think about in the midst of this. So let's pray together. So God, we just honor you this morning on this Father's Day. I think about, God, how you are the best dad. You are so good. And so, God, we know that, God, there are times in life where maybe our earthly fathers aren't so great, but gosh, God, you're so good. And so we just want to give you credit and honor and glory this morning for being that. And it's been an honor to worship you. And now, God, as we take a look deeper into this story, that you would make our hearts, our souls, our minds sticky, and supernatural things would stick to us, that we would be more like Jesus as a result of our time together, that we would be, in some senses, I think, more like Abraham in this story. Do something supernatural among us, God. Teach us something, encourage us, challenge us. Whatever you want to do, God, we're open to whatever you want to do. So come and do what you want to do with us. Pray this in Jesus' name. And everybody said? Amen. All right, we have 2 points today. Here's the first one you can write down as first takeaway, looking at Abraham's altar. Number 1 is this. Abraham's altar teaches us to know that God may challenge us. You can write that down in your hand. Abraham's altar teaches us to know that God may challenge us. We're going to sit here for just a few minutes, but I think just kind of give you a little bit of confidence, folks. I think that this particular point is, and the idea of God challenging is a kind of a spiritual truth that is a little hard to grasp and understand. And for some, maybe it's a new way of thinking about God. But the truth, folks, is that God, in his goodness, may challenge you. In his goodness may challenge me. In his goodness may challenge us. And I do say in his goodness because, folks, the reality is when God challenges us, he doesn't challenge us because he wants to be sinister or mean or vindictive. He's doing it. If he's challenging us, it's because it is for our betterment. This is for our good. And we actually see this test, this challenge in the text with Abraham. Again, just look at it in verses 1 and 2. Again, it says in Genesis 22, it says, sometime later, and I underlined it, it said, God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham, and here's the test. It says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. I mean, talk about a test, a God challenge. I'm like, God, you want me to do what with my son? I mean, you want me to take him to the mountain and do what? You want me to literally slay my only son? Now, of course, we don't see Abraham say that at all, right? We're going to look at that in point 2 today. But like, oh my goodness, talk about a challenge that God put in front of Abraham. It wasn't just some simple little task. This was a big deal. And I think it's important for us to know, folks, that God can, and likely will, do that same thing with us. Some. It's not going to be a lot. I mean, this didn't happen a ton in Abraham's life. There were a few different times in his lifetime that there was these big challenges, these big moments in his life that God challenged him to do something. And so if God did that with Abraham, who, by the way, became one of the patriarchs of our faith, right? It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? If this became like a thing that God would do with this patriarch, the fact is, folks, we ought to kind of consider the fact he's probably going to do it with us. God's going to do this with us too. And it's because he cares enough about us to do so. I was thinking about, it's Father's Day, and so I've got 3 kids, folks. There are times where Leah and I, my wife and I, we will intentionally put a challenge in front of our kid because we know that challenge will strengthen them in the long run. And I don't want them living in my house when they're 30. Right? So I intentionally put things in front of my children sometimes to give them some challenge so that they can gain something. And God does, and it's not because I want to be sinister or mean to my kids, it's because I love them enough to do it. I want them to be human beings that can be self-sustaining. Because gosh, I don't want to be, that's a side note, I'm not getting into that, all right. But I do this because the reality of I want to see them thrive. And so, folks, the truth is, and this is not something that's probably a new revelation for you, but folks, do you know that we grow the most as human beings when we are challenged? We grow the most when we're challenged. Actually, experts even say that we will grow the most exponentially, we'll have the biggest leaps forward in our life when we are, listen to this, slightly overly challenged. So it's not even that there's a challenge in front of us, but we are like, okay, hey, there's a challenge and there's a little more. That's where we thrive the most. We grow the most. I mean, aren't you excited you guys came to church on Father's Day? Go get challenged because that's where we're going to grow, right? It's no different than and again, you probably heard this illustration, but it's like the butterfly, right? Like if you take a butterfly, the caterpillar goes into the cocoon. If you cut the cocoon of a caterpillar when it's ready to become a butterfly, if you cut that cocoon, folks, it won't be able to fly. Experts say that that butterfly needs the twisting and the turning. I don't know why I'm doing this, but it's the twisting and turning of getting out of the cocoon to strengthen the wings to fly. Folks, you and I, we need those things in our life to be able to, that we have to wrestle through and fight for so that we can have wings to fly. And the reality is somebody can make it easier for you, but it's likely you will then be grounded. And I will be grounded. We need that struggle. I was thinking this week about my own life. And I was thinking about those times where it's so interesting as human beings, we could wake up and say, Lord, I hope that you give me a good day. How many of you know if we always have a good day, we ain't going to be where we need to be? And so I understand the reality of wanting a good day, but the truth of the matter is, folks, we need hard days so we can be better on the other side. And I know that when we're in the middle of a challenge, we just want to be out of the challenge. But I was thinking this week about those challenges in my life. And I just took 2 minutes and I thought about those things in my life that if I wouldn't have had them, I wouldn't be where I am. And then there are a couple things that's like, ooh, that one would have been nice to just completely be off the table. And so there's probably some of those too. But folks, there are some things as I thought through my life, I was like, yeah, I needed that one. I needed that one because I couldn't be here if I wouldn't have gone through that. And so, like, in some senses, we got to be thankful of the fact that we have these challenges in our lives, because that's where we can grow. And so what we have to do is if we look at the story of Abraham, folks, we have to have on our spiritual grid, on some level, this challenge stuff coming from a loving God, like we see here with Abraham. I've actually heard another pastor once call this, and you can actually write this down on your handout. I've heard him call this the Mount Moriah experience. Remember, because this happened, Abraham was called to take Isaac to the mountain of Moriah, right? And so this happened there. And so these are those times where God just throws out a zinger of a challenge to us. And I think he does this. God can throw these zingers of challenges out to us because it will teach us something. It will grow us in something. Or sometimes it will actually just be a reminder when we go, we're doubting my abilities and my giftings and the things that are, God will go, no, you already have that in you. I put it in you. You already have that. I gifted that from your birth. And sometimes he'll walk us through these things so we can remember those things. And then this pastor went on to say, he was like, listen, if you are a follower of Jesus, I know so many of you here today, you're a follower of Jesus, you've committed your life to Christ. If you're here a follower of Jesus and you have never had a Mount Moriah experience, he said this, he said, be on the lookout because it's coming. And here's why, because, right, once we give our lives over to Jesus, right, when he's then in the driver's seat of our life, when he gets to dictate where we go and what we don't go and what we say and what we don't say, the reality is we also then say, okay, then I'm going to go where you go, and it means when he throws out a challenge, then we actually go through the challenge. He said, listen, if you've never had a Mount Moriah experience, be on the lookout because it's coming. And then I thought about when Jesus did this. And I always think about, okay, we're going to look in the Old Testament for some stuff, but then I like when we get to see Jesus then reiterate what's in the Old Testament. And so I was thinking this week about, in the Gospels, we actually see 3 of the 4 Gospels in Mark 10, Matthew 19, and Luke 18. We see Jesus' interaction with a guy that the Bible labels as the rich young ruler, right? He's the rich young ruler. And Jesus, in this moment with the rich young ruler, he kind of does what God does with Abraham in this story. Jesus looks at this rich young ruler, and he throws out this massive challenge to this rich young ruler. And it's interesting because the rich young ruler has a response we're going to look at in just a second. But there's this hefty challenge, and so what Jesus is just taking cues from the Father, right? And so he looks at this rich young ruler who, by the way, earlier says, hey, that he's been basically doing all the 10 Commandments since he was a young boy, which, by the way, is not easy to do. We actually just finished a series on that, right? He says, Jesus says to this guy in verse 17, but it actually says first of him, he says that Jesus looked at him and loved him. I think that's really an important part of this. Because remember, it's out of God's goodness that he challenges us, not out of sin or snare or vindictive or those kind of things. So Jesus looked at this rich young ruler and loved him to say this. He said, listen, one thing you lack. Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. At this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth. And so you got Jesus, this earthly spiritual father, saying, hey, listen, you want to follow? You want to go into the kingdom of God? You want to live the way that you're supposed to live in that? Man, go sell everything, and then you got that. By the way, I don't think that would be easy. I don't think it would be easy to live with nothing, but the reality is I've actually heard of some people, even in the last 10 years, some pastors who actually done that. And so the reality is whether it could be easy to do or not easy to do, the reality is Jesus threw the challenge out. But he didn't go after it. The rich young ruler didn't go after it. We're actually told that he went away sad. And from what we know in Scripture is that he lived the rest of his life outside of the will of God because he wasn't willing to take the challenge that Jesus put out there. And so I think this was what I would consider also a Mount Moriah kind of moment here for the rich young ruler. And I think it signifies, folks, that yes, we should do the things in our spiritual lives that are fairly easy to do, right? Yes, we should come to church. And yes, we should read the Scripture and we should pray, but we should also do the really, really hard things. We got to do the really, really hard things too. When God says to you, like, hey, go do this or stop doing that or those kind of things, then we should do what he said, even if there's zingers of things to do. I was thinking about my own life, and there's actually been a few of those moments in my own life. And again, remember, these Mount Moriah experiences are not like weekly or monthly or even yearly, but over the course of my now 43 years of life, I can point to a couple things. And I was thinking back to when my first ministry job. And I think I've told this story before, but my very first ministry job was working in a summer camp up in Michigan. And I went for the interview, and man, I was already feeling like the Lord was leaning me towards this ministry. And so I went to the interview. It was just awesome, man. I fell in love with the ministry, fell in love with the people. And so then I come home, and Leah, of course, my wife, she's like, hey, how'd the interview go? And I was like, oh, it's awesome, man. I think this is really where the Lord's leading us. I'm super excited, those kind of things. And I said, but, how many of you know sometimes the but's really hard? So I said, but they said that my salary is on missionary support. So they will give us half of my salary, but then we have to ask people for money for the rest of it. How many of you know my wife was like, well, we ain't going there. But folks, I will tell you that in that moment, right? And I understand that, right? Because like this is a Mount Moriah experience, right? Like we had 2 kids at that point, right? Like we have mouths to feed, right? Like you're supposed to feed kids, I guess, or something like that, right? Like the real, like you're supposed to feed the kids. There's supposed to be something, the roof overhead, and so like now we got to ask people for money. Mount Moriah experience. But we went there and we were there for 4 years, and God did incredible things in our ministry there. And by the way, the whole time we were there, we always, every single month, made our support. We were never in need for money. And then I thought about the fact that, like even planting this church, right? 5 years ago, we started this church. And man, talk about a Mount Moriah experience, right? When you get called to something and you're like, is it going to work? And we don't really know. And so, like, I quit my job, right, at another church to start this church. And so then even my brother-in-law, who, by the way, love him, but he's like one of those guys that like we're not quite sure where he is at with Jesus. And when we told the family that we're planting this church, he looked at me and said, so what are you going to do for money? And I was like, I don't know. No, God's been faithful and those kind of things. But there was this whole, and and then even last night, it was so crazy, folks. Like last night, my family and I just randomly, we started to watch The Greatest Showman. Have you ever seen that movie? That came out in December of 2018. If you guys remember, we planted this church in 2019. And so in the end of 2018 through 2019, I watched that movie over and over and it inspired me to plant this church. When he's like singing about like all these colors and all these dreams and all these things. And so, but I was scared out of my mind. I was scared. Right? And so this was a Mount Moriah experience, and we're like putting our life on the line and sticking our neck out for the kingdom, right? And so like I'm so grateful for you all, and I'm so grateful for this building, and I'm so grateful for what God has done in the last 5 years. But it was a Mount Moriah experience, and I resisted. Like even my friend Rob over here told me I should have planted a church even like 3 years before that, and I said, you're nuts. And we still are friends. But he was right. And it's this Mount Moriah experience in the midst of this. And so like those were big, big deals. And so like I've had these moments where like the Lord said, there's a challenge, Matt. Are you going to take it? And we've seen the Lord show up when we've said yes. But then I was like thinking like, okay, those are like big things. Like those are like super big things. And then I was thinking about like sometimes though, somehow, the saying like the mountain is a molehill, right? Or a molehill is a mountain, right? So I was thinking about back to even just like things like when God would say to me, hey, that person that you're really mad at, that hurt you, I want you to reconcile with them. How many of you know that can be quite a Mount Moriah experience, right? Because the reality is that because I don't want to reconcile them because they hurt me. I don't want to give them the satisfaction of that. But the reality is like I can either, if the Lord says, here's this challenge, Matt, like the rich young ruler, am I going to walk away sad? Or I'm going to leave the daggers in, or I'm going to walk out the challenge of the Lord. You see, I'm telling you, folks, if you're here today and you're a follower of Jesus, I would tell you if you've never experienced the Mount Moriah experience, be on the lookout, it's coming. Because when you submit yourself to the Lordship of Christ, He's going to then ask you to do something that's probably not going to be easy for you to do. And it may only be one or a couple, but there's going to be something that's going to show up. God, in His goodness, may challenge you, probably will challenge you. He's challenged me. And that's just kind of repeating the point then today. So you can bring that point up. Yeah, Abraham's altar teaches us to know that God may challenge us. So we know that, but so the question is how are we going to respond? How are we going to respond? And so I think this actually brings up this question for us today to consider for our own lives. Is there a challenge? Ask yourself this question. Is there a challenge I need to be facing that God has put in front of me? Ask yourself, is there a challenge? And it may be something emotionally, relationally, physically, financially, spiritually. Is there a challenge? You can leave it up there for just a second, Tim, if you would. Is there a challenge? And I'll just tell you, folks, my human response when God challenges me oftentimes is to resist. I'm just being honest with you. And so the reality of it is don't resist today. If something comes to your mind with that question, maybe consider walking out of here and do something about that challenge. Maybe it's a time right now. We have two examples, right? We have Abraham right here who God said, hey, take your son and go kill him on this mountain. And he went to do whatever he had to do. And we also have the rich young ruler on the other side who walked away sad and outside the will of God for the rest of his life. Maybe today, if there's a challenge in front of you, maybe it's time for Abraham and not the rich young ruler. I think it's something to think about. Because here's the reality. This was only a test, right? This was only a test. Don't get into your mind that God wanted Isaac to die. No, this was only a test. God, as a good dad, just wanted to see if his son would respond. And actually, which leads me directly into our second point today, how Abraham responds. It's actually the greater of the two lessons today. And the main point of this altar and this sacred encounter, you can write this in on your handout. Abraham's altar teaches us, number 2, to always answer God with a yes, sir. The emoji, yes, sir, right? Abraham's altar teaches us to always answer God with a yes, sir. This point's kind of straightforward. Do what God says. Do what God asks. Give him a yes, sir, right? And the reason it's the point is because really it's the point of the entire altar, all right? Throughout this entire text, I don't know if you saw it when we read through it, but man, we see layer after layer after layer of obedience and submission from Abraham to God. And obedience and submission from Abraham to God in something that was kind of a crazy request, right? I mean, we'll just kind of walk through it line by line, right? So it's even right off the bat in verse 1, it says this again. It says, God said to him, Abraham. And how does he respond? He says, here I am. He was like, yo, God, what's up? Because that's how they talk in the Bible. Yo, God. Right? He's like, listen, hey, God, okay, yeah, God, what's up? What's on your mind? What's on your agenda for me? Whatever you want to do, God, I'm ready. Look, tell me. He's being obedient and submissive. Right? And then verse 3, after he tells him that he wants him to take Isaac and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah, he doesn't argue with God. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't ask why. The text simply says that early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him. So he jumped on it. No delayed obedience or disobedience, just submission to the request. I thought about it like if you've ever seen the movie The Princess Bride, it was kind of like this. Abraham was like, as you wish. Okay, God, as you wish. Submission, simple, submissive submission, and the unthinkable thing. And for me, it's just an incredible thought from Abraham. Incredible faith and trust and obedience and submission here. But wait, there's more. I feel like I'm like an obedience salesman. Oh, wait, there's more. All right. So verse 9, right? He goes on to verse 9. It says, when they reached a place God told him about, Abraham built an altar there. There's our phrase, right? Built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of he wasn't holding anything back. In his mind, on the one hand, I go, okay, I can track with this, right? On the one hand, he's thinking, okay, well, God is the Lord. And he's the Lord of my life. And so he has a total authority over me as the creator and my God. And so everything, he has the right to dictate what I do and what I don't do and where I go and what I do and what I avoid and all those kind of things. By the way, if you've given your life over to Jesus, made him the Lord of your life. That's what that means. You don't get to be in charge, and I don't get to be in charge of what we do and what we don't do and what we say and what we don't say. No, he's in the driver's seat, and we are the passenger princess or passenger prince. He's dictating those things. And so he is on this one side, he's thinking, okay, like the Lord's in the driver's seat. I guess I'm going along. Here we go. But folks, as I thought about that a little bit more this week, I was thinking, yes, though he has that on one side of his brain, can I tell you the other side had to have been this thought. Yes, Lord, but this is my son. As the text says, it's his only son, right? It's his only son. And folks, this would not have been simply saying, okay, hey, go create a campfire. Like this was a big deal, his only son. And so to help us understand the emotion of that, because there was so much emotion in that, I'm going to invite my son, Elijah, my only son, on stage, okay? So y'all give Elijah a big round of applause this morning. okay? And so here's what I want you to understand about this, because again, Elijah is my only son. And so take this like it's dad and only son, okay? But what does the text say happens when he gets to Mount Moriah? What's the first thing that happens? What does Isaac do? Or what does Abraham do? He takes what? He takes rope and he binds his son, okay? So here we go. I'm going to do this. All right. Well, I'm going to get dizzy probably doing this. How tight should I make this? Should I like cut off his circulation? All right.
You said yes.
Somebody said yes. All right. Okay. All right. So he binds his son up, right? And so again, right now, like, just think about what's going through Isaac's brain. What's Isaac thinking when his dad's binding? He's like, Dad, what's going on? What's the second thing the text says happens? What does his dad do? He lays the wood on the altar, right? Okay. And what does he do? Not just to put the wood on the altar, what does he ultimately do? He sets his son down on the altar. I got you. Okay. And he starts just, okay. What's next? The knife. Now I have a butter knife this morning. I didn't feel very comfortable with the knife, okay? But what does it say that he does? He grabs the knife and what? Begins to get ready to strike his son. Okay? So I know this is going to look really weird on camera, right? But he raises the knife. Before what? Then the angel says, Abraham, don't lay a hand on him, right? Folks, as I was thinking about this week with my son, and I said this first service, Elijah is going to be a sophomore at Bethel University. And it's been really good to have my son home from college. And I know he's only 10 minutes away, but I would tell you something, like some of you know that some of the transitions that are happening in the church, those kind of things, I have not been in a good mental health space in the last month. And my son, just like about 2 weeks ago, asked his mom, because he could see me at home, and he was like, Mom, is Dad okay? And by the way, I wasn't okay. And my son caring for me has been an incredible gift to me in this season. So I appreciate you, man. I love you. But I tell you that because this is not, some dads and sons have really bad relationships. I have a good relationship with my kid for the most part, right? Folks, I don't think Now, I'm not going to hurt him, right? But I don't think I could raise this knife to my son. Now, I might give him a haircut because he's got long hair right now. Folks, I don't think that I could raise this knife to my kid. Do you understand the emotion that was in? This is not just some random fable story. This is history. Abraham was willing to raise the knife to his son before God intervened. That is an incredible submission to God. Now, I got to get my son up here because I'm not going to sacrifice him. Legit. Okay. All right. All right. Here we go. All right. Can you all give Elijah a big round of applause again? So I bring Elijah on stage because, folks, I think sometimes we can read these stories and we don't realize the depth of them. This was deep. This was so deep that this dad was willing to raise a knife to his kid. This emotion was significant, and yet what happened? His submission to God rose above all else. That is an incredible faith. Can I say something that I want to be like Abraham when I grow up? I want that kind of faith to God to do whatever he asks me to do. And so here's the truth of what I want to get as we get ready to close. Folks, the truth of the matter is that duty and allegiance from Abraham went to God. It went to God. And so I want us to consider the fact, ask ourselves, where does that land in our life? Where does it land in our life? Where does our duty and our allegiance land in our life? Who gets our duty and our allegiance most? Do we? Do we get our allegiance most? Does our spouse, do our kids, does our job, does the country? What gets our top priority? The example we see here from Abraham is that God and God alone got that priority. He always answered God with a yes, sir. And that, even if that meant saying no, this is important, even if that meant saying no to other important people in his life, even his only son. I think if we can transition that to us, folks, God is going to ask us to do some things. If we're submitting our lives to God, he's going to ask us to do some things. Will he get our duty and allegiance? Will it be him and him alone in our life? Or will it be those other? And I'll just admit to you, I know that those other things are really easy sometimes to knock God off the top spot, like spouse and kids and job and those kinds. But the reality is, what we see is that the top spot has to be always God. So when God asks, what will we do? When God asks, what will we do? Now, he's not going to ask you to sacrifice your child, right? Because God sent Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice once and for all. So this will be off the table. But I made a list of things. What about if what he asks you is to change something about your life? And change something that you don't really want to change. Or maybe he asks you to stop doing something or start doing something or serve more or sacrifice more. Maybe you have to give more. Maybe there's giving more time and more money and more resources. Maybe it's starting a ministry. Maybe it's starting a group, caring for the poor, becoming a foster parent, caring for widows, and the list could go on and on. And if God asks you to do something, will you do it? He's going to ask you to do some things. What will be your response? Will we? Are we now? How do we and will we respond when God asks? The example from Abraham is a simple yes, sir, above all else. Now, I say simple. It's simple to say. It's not simple to do. I don't know about you, but I want to do that. I want to do that with all that God has in front of me. If God says, do this, Matt, I just want to say yes, sir. I want to do that. But folks, for us to be able to do that, man, I got to tell you, we got to prioritize God in our lives. We have to be intentional, getting to know him, spending time with him in order to trust him like Abraham trusted him. Because, again, Abraham spent time with the Lord. Which actually begs the question, and I'm going to end with this today. It'll come up on the screen, folks. I think this begs the question, am I chasing God? Are you chasing God? Are you chasing him like Abraham in order to do what he did at this altar? Maybe today that is the thing to take from today. Maybe we need to pick up the pace of what our chase is towards heavenly things, towards God. And then if we can pick up the pace of our chase, maybe the byproduct will be more of an ability to say yes, sir, to God. I think something to think about, maybe evaluate in our lives, but certainly something that Abraham's altar teaches us. Certainly that it's always good, and the way we should do it is answer God with a yes, sir. So maybe that's something for you to consider. And so with that, I'm going to ask you to stand where you are this morning, and we're going to move into a time of response.